I thought what I would do is, before my fellow panelists get into some of the very specific issues that they're dealing with and that they have thoughts about and have done research on, I thought I would get us all onto the same page, roughly, by looking at very general issues here. And maybe some of them are very, for those of you who've been looking at AI and governance for a while, or governance or AI for a while, it might be very introductory. But I thought it would be good to maybe get everybody in the room looking at a relatively common framework. So I wanted to start by, first of all, pointing out that we have, as with all these pairs, AI and health, AI and employment, with all these pairs, we have we have actually two issues, right? There's AI for governance. So how can we use AI tools in helping us in governance? But there's also the other direction, which is how should we govern AI and this new technology? And I'll be focusing on the second one, but I do want to acknowledge up front that there's a lot of very interesting work being done on the former question, and that's something that should be kept in mind throughout this afternoon. Now, governance is not the same as ethics, but there's a connection between our ethical objectives for involving a technology like AI and our governance goals as well. So I just thought I would list here, it's not an exhaustive list, but some of the more famous issues concerning the ethics of AI, because ethics provides an input, or at least it should, perhaps, to governance issues. We had a great a series of lectures on Monday evening concerning privacy from, amongst other people, Edward Snowden. And that's obviously a big issue when you have data around that AI is using in a very big way. And there's the whole question of data and info ownership, the fairness of AI, inclusiveness of AI, deception or manipulation by using AI. But I'll be focusing on this question about transparency and explainability, in particular, how it impacts on liability. Now, I've got responsibility up there as well with a question mark after it, and that's because I want that to remind me to say that I would, if you don't remember anything else from this talk, from my contribution to the panel, I'd want you to remember, if you could only remember one thing, remember this, that there's no sense in which AI systems are responsible for anything. It's only the actors around AI systems that are responsible, and it's just that one of the key challenges of AI is that it makes those lines of responsibility and which humans and which human organizations are responsible. It makes them responsible makes it a little more difficult to calculate. And so I think that's one of the great challenges. But we shouldn't think that, despite the fact we often talk about these AI systems as being agents of a sort, they are not agents with any responsibility. And then, of course, there's the social or environmental impact that we need to consider when we're looking at ethics. So that's not governance, but it suggests what the challenges might be for AI, for the case of AI, when you're considering governance. Now, here's a rough idea of what I mean by governance as a first pass. It's not quite right. You'll see in I only have two more slides, and at the second of those, you'll see that I correct this in a way. But just to make sure we're all roughly on the same page, what we mean here is what kind of instruments can organizations, governments, yes, but also other organizations, what kind of instruments can they use in order to take these ethical objectives and other objectives that aren't necessarily ethical, might be financial or something else. How can they take these instruments and use them to make sure that the AI tools that are being deployed or being built help achieve those ethical objectives or maintain those ethical constraints? And these are to be, these are strong words here. They're not quite right? Imposed on, not necessarily, if it's a democratic governance, then we shouldn't think of them as being imposed. We shouldn't necessarily think about enforcement. Maybe some notion of compliance is more appropriate here. But that's the general picture. Now I want to move to, from ethics to governance and look at the specific challenges of governing AI, facing governance of AI. And I think it has to do with the scale and pervasiveness of AI technology. This wasn't a pressing issue 20 years ago, 10 years ago maybe, when the use of AI technology wasn't so predominant, wasn't possible, and also when the scale of the data being used by these systems wasn't so great. But more importantly, I think, is the complexity of these systems that really gets in the way of traditional approaches to technology governance, because of the issues of trust and transparency that are raised. It's difficult to calculate risk and liability. As I said before, when you have systems that are learning relatively autonomously, then it's hard to tell whether, how should we trace lines of liability when a designer is going to deny that the particular solution that was derived out was one that they developed. Instead, it was the one that supposedly the system developed. So I think there's an illusion of autonomy here in AI systems that I already warned you against. So what are some partial solutions, just to finish up in my last minute? I said my notion of governance, that slide 2 slides ago, is incorrect. Well, here's one way that it was incorrect. We don't just have regulations and laws to work with in governance, but we have, the term governance usually is usually meant to open your mind about different ways that we might achieve society's goals other than by just passing laws and making regulations. We might be trying to think of how we can redesign markets, how we can introduce incentives, introduce nudges in a way that a certain outcome can be achieved without having to have an explicit regulation or law in place. These are often quite difficult to construct, though. You have to think of society as a system to be engineered rather than a traditional legal framework, perhaps. But one idea is that AI can come to the rescue here, that complexity of governing AI might itself be managed by using AI systems. And that might sound paradoxical or a way to madness, but I think it should be investigated, as it seems quite promising. And AI itself might be useful in another way, in that an important way to solve the problem of democratic governance, democratic in particular governance of AI, is to have an informed public. So I have listed education here 3 times. This is my final point. I list education here 3 times because it's not just policymakers and regulators who need to know about AI systems to have good governance. It's not just workers that need to be upskilled in order to have some of the outcomes that we want, but we also need the general public to understand what data is, what AI is and is not doing, in order to be able to have proper democratic governance. So with that, I will leave you well, actually, I'm supposed to stay up here for a question or 2, I think, so I will not leave you yet.
Thank you, Ron. Great setting the stage. We'll be actually picking up on quite a few of these words and concepts and developing them in both panels. So if I can take you on the pervasiveness and scale and how complex it is, and in a way linking to the education that you kind of looped into the end of the presentation. So what is the role of academia, of people like you, thought leaders, in making sure that the general public, all of us, not only the general public, but people actually who work in different sectors in using it and daily, maybe not even necessarily being aware that they are using it. How can thought leaders and academia help to make people much more aware of all the benefits and of the risks that AI can take, so that there is then a possibility to decide and take control in a way, take the responsibility in a way that we all have to have?
Right. Well, I think let's take the last point I made about educating not workers or policymakers, but just the general public. We can't educate them unless we understand it ourselves. So there are several really key conceptual, foundational questions that are actually philosophical and theoretical that we still don't have very clear answers to. Questions about What's the difference between data and information? And how can they be the kinds of things that somebody can own or pass ownership to? These are relatively philosophical questions that we are still grappling with. We need in academia and in partnership with industry and regulating bodies, but mainly the academics have to achieve this. They have to provide clear answer to these questions so that the K-12 educator can give AI literacy, can help people become, children in particular, but all the general public become AI and information literate. So they can't do that until we have a clear view of what needs to be taught. But there are many other ways that academia can contribute. Obviously, all the research into tools that can make, if we're worried about privacy, then maybe if you put tools in the hands of the individual people, they can use it as a way to fight against intrusions of privacy. So there are all kinds of ways that academics can contribute here.
Right. And then I'd like to zoom a little bit in on the responsibility that you actually raised. And I would say it's responsibility of all of us to, in a way, be aware of what is the control that we may have, but also what is the control that we are really giving up. Because clearly, if you are aware of pervasiveness of tracking, of using of your data, and sometimes you're not necessarily aware of that. But for the ease of convenience, we'd like to keep that, and we will give up quite a lot of our freedom and our control over the ease of obtaining what we really want, of personalized content that we like to live with, of landing back where you left it 3 days ago, and so on and so forth. I mean, we had this discussion. So what is your take? I mean, we are responsible, right? So how do we reconcile the two? Do we actually just give up on that?
No, well, I think you're providing you're beginning the discussion of what are some of the design constraints we want in an AI solution to the AI problem. And in this particular case, because Sonia and I were both at Edward Snowden's talk, we're thinking about the privacy issue. So you're right. If it takes too much effort for us to fight against intrusive or unwanted tracking and privacy violation, then we'll lose. But the goal for any AI tool that's going to help us counter that has to be that it's just as easy to opt into it as it is to opt into the kinds of intrusions on our privacy that we've been experiencing over the last few years. So that's an example of a design constraint that comes out of this discussion we're having today.
Very good. Thank you so much, Ron, for setting the stage.